The railroad tracks behind the neighborhood were quiet. A back fence leaned toward the right-of-way, and beyond it the steel rails ran into the dark like two straight lines cut into the earth. Inside the house, the lights were off. Dr. Claudia Benton had fallen asleep alone, her husband and children away, the routine of a weeknight settling over a small, well-kept suburb tucked inside Houston. Sometime before dawn, a stranger came through the yard. There was no car in the driveway to warn him off, no barking dog heard in time, no neighbor looking out a window. The intruder moved the way someone moves when he has done it before. Quiet, unhurried, listening. He forced entry, slipped inside, and reached the bedroom. What happened next would be described later by investigators in the blunt language of wounds and evidence. Benton was attacked in her bed and stabbed repeatedly, including injuries to her back and hands as she tried to defend herself. That murder, on December 16, 1998, would become the case Texas could prove. But it was not the beginning. It was one stop on a moving route that crossed state lines and blurred jurisdictions, because the man suspected of killing Benton didn't travel like most killers. He traveled by freight rail, slipping into towns without a vehicle, without a fixed address, and often without a name anyone could pin down. Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was born in Mexico in 1959. In the years that followed, he drifted between Mexico and the United States, entering the U.S. illegally and living on the margins. He used aliases, including Rafael Reséndiz Ramirez, and he learned how to move through the country in a way that left little trace. Freight trains became his highway. Rail yards became his map. When he jumped off near a town, he could be gone into neighborhoods before anyone knew a stranger was nearby. By the late 1990s, reports and cases began to connect in a way that made law enforcement uneasy. Attacks were happening near rail lines. Victims were often in homes close to tracks or in isolated areas where a person could appear and disappear quickly. There were burglaries, assaults, and murders, sometimes involving blunt force, knives, or tools grabbed at the scene. The pattern was messy, but the geography kept repeating: the rails, the yards, the right-of-ways that stitched the country together. One of the clearest early warnings came in the summer of 1997, near Lexington, Kentucky. Holly Dunn and her boyfriend were young, planning a life, walking along tracks on a bridge when a man attacked them. The assault was brutal. Dunn survived, badly injured, and later became one of the only people to live through an encounter with the man investigators would come to call the railroad killer. Her account mattered because it gave something investigators often lacked in these cases: a living witness, a description, and a survivor's certainty about what had been done. Around that same period, another killing would later be linked to the growing case file: the murder of Christopher Meyer, a college student in Kentucky, attacked in a way that investigators saw as part of the same roaming spree. Different states held different pieces, one victim here, another there, each case owned by local departments that didn't yet know they were chasing the same shadow. The murders that drew the most attention, and the ones that finally pushed the case into a national manhunt, happened between 1997 and 1999. Reséndiz was suspected in killings across multiple states, including Texas and Illinois. Some victims were elderly, living in homes that backed up to rail corridors. In several cases, the scenes suggested sudden violence, people surprised inside their own houses, killed and left where they fell, with evidence of break-ins and theft. The crimes looked like a drifting predator taking what he wanted, then disappearing back into a moving system that could carry him hundreds of miles overnight. By the time Claudia Benton was murdered in West University Place, Texas, the pressure was building. Investigators were not just looking at one homicide. They were watching a cluster of crimes that refused to stay inside county borders. Tips came in. Composite sketches circulated. Agencies compared notes. The FBI became involved as the suspect's movements grew clearer and the fear widened. A man who could step off a freight train, kill, and vanish had the advantage of randomness. He could be anywhere the tracks could take him. After Benton's murder, evidence began to sharpen the focus. Law enforcement built a case around suspects, methods, and forensic links that could stand in court. At the same time, the broader picture remained hauntingly uncertain. Reséndiz would later admit to multiple killings, 9 by many reports, while investigators believed the true number was higher. Some sources put the suspected total into the teens, and some investigators publicly suggested even more. What was certain was the damage. Families across states trying to understand why their loved one had been targeted, and why the person responsible seemed to move through the country like smoke. In June 1999, the case hit a turning point. Reséndiz was named to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted Fugitives list on June 21st. His face and aliases spread nationwide. The publicity was intended to close the net, to make it harder for him to hide. But the same publicity also intensified the fear, because it confirmed what many suspected. The killings were connected, and the suspect was still out there, still capable of stepping off the rails and into someone's life. The end came not through a dramatic chase, but through a family door. In July 1999, Reséndiz's sister became central to the surrender. Authorities worked through her, and she helped arrange the moment he would give himself up. On July 13, 1999, Reséndiz surrendered in El Paso to a Texas Ranger. The image of capture people imagine, lights, sirens, a cornered fugitive, was replaced by something quieter, a man turning himself in. The spree halted, not by a shootout, but by the final closing of options. His arrest did not bring immediate closure. It brought paperwork, trials, and the slow grind of proving what could be proven. Reséndiz faced accusations in multiple jurisdictions, but the case that carried him to a death sentence was the murder of Claudia Benton. In Texas court, prosecutors focused on what they could tie to him with evidence strong enough to survive appeals. The defense raised questions about mental health, and later, as his execution approached, courts evaluated whether he was competent to be executed. On June 27, 2006, Ángel Maturino Reséndiz was executed by lethal injection in Texas. For the people who had followed the case, the end felt both final and incomplete. Final, because the man who rode the rails and left bodies behind would never walk free again. Incomplete, because so many cases tied to him lived in the uneasy space between suspicion and proof. Some families had answers in court records. Others had only the belief, backed by investigators' conclusions, that their loved one had crossed the path of the same traveling killer. The rail lines are still there. They still run behind neighborhoods, past warehouses, through empty land, and into cities where people don't think about who else might be watching the tracks. The railroad killer case is remembered not only for the brutality of the crimes, but for how ordinary the entry points were. A fence near a right-of-way, a back door, a quiet street, the assumption that home is a boundary. For a few years, for a few terrifying miles of steel, that boundary failed. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.